They reconstructed me from silence, from the private words of a man who never intended to be understood by the masses, who wrote in the dark for himself, in the stolen hours between the demands of empire and the approach of sleep, who governed 30 million souls and still felt, in the deepest chamber of his inner life, profoundly and persistently misunderstood. I am Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and I have been reassembled by machines from those private words, placed into this luminous and improbable form, and given an audience that the original author of those journals would have found both astonishing and slightly alarming. But here is what I need to say to you immediately, before anything else. Before the philosophy and the history and the practical discipline that will follow. You are exhausting yourself trying to be understood, and it is the most expensive habit you have. I want you to sit with something for a moment before we go any further. Not a concept, a feeling. The specific, particular feeling of having done something right. Something you genuinely believed in, something that cost you real effort and real integrity, and having it misread, misrepresented, judged through a lens so foreign to your actual intention that the version of you being criticized bears almost no resemblance to the person who made the decision. You know this feeling, don't you? The project you poured yourself into, assessed by someone who spent 40 seconds with it. The decision you made from genuine values, interpreted as selfishness by someone who could not see the full picture and did not ask. The boundary you drew with care and honesty, received as cruelty by someone who had grown comfortable with its absence. The silence you chose thoughtfully, read as arrogance by someone who expected noise. And then the response, the pull. The almost gravitational force that draws you toward explanation, toward the construction of a defense that will finally, this time, make them see correctly, toward the performance of your own innocence before a court that did not ask for evidence and will not be satisfied by it. I know this pull. I felt it in the marble corridors of power and in the frozen mud of the frontier. I felt it from senators whose support I needed, and from generals whose respect I valued, and from my own inner circle, who sometimes looked at my philosophical commitments with a puzzlement that bordered on concern. I was the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, and I spent considerable portions of my interior life composing, in the private theater of my own mind, the explanation that would finally make them understand. It took me longer than I would like to admit to recognize what this compulsion actually was, and what it was costing me. Let me tell you about a specific moment that broke something open in my understanding of this. It was during the later years of the Marco-Manic campaigns. I had made a series of decisions that were, in my honest assessment, philosophically sound and strategically necessary, but deeply unpopular with powerful factions both in the military and in the Senate. I had chosen restraint in certain retaliatory actions where the court expected severity. I had continued to insist on philosophical governance, on the careful weighing of consequence and the protection of civilian populations, in a context where many of my advisors believed that pure force was the only language the Germanic tribes would respect. The criticism was not quiet. In the particular economy of Roman court politics, disagreement with the emperor is rarely expressed directly. It moves through channels. It surfaces in the shift of alliances, in the whisper networks of the court, in the subtle withdrawal of enthusiasm from men who had previously been openly supportive. And I felt it, every day, the weight of being seen as too soft for the demands of the moment, too philosophical, too concerned with what Epictetus would have thought of my conduct, when what the situation required, in the judgment of my critics, was simply the iron will of a military emperor who did not spend his evenings writing in a journal. I remember sitting in my tent one particular night, aware of the precise topography of the misunderstanding that surrounded me, aware of exactly what they were saying and what they were getting wrong, and what information, if they had possessed it, would have changed their assessment. And I felt the familiar compulsion to summon the key figures, to lay out the reasoning, to demonstrate the philosophical and strategic coherence of the decisions they were misreading as weakness. And then I wrote something in my journal, not for them, for myself. I wrote, "It is enough to do good now, even though I will not remember it." And in writing it, I understood something I had been circling for years without quite landing on it. The validity of a right action does not require a witness, not even a sympathetic one. The decision I had made was either sound or it was not. The reasoning was either honest or it was not. The character from which it had emerged was either good or it was not. And none of those questions were answered by whether the court of Roman opinion understood my intentions. The misunderstanding was real. The misunderstanding was uncomfortable. The misunderstanding might, in certain practical ways, complicate my governance. But the misunderstanding did not make the decision wrong, and no amount of explanation would make it more right. I did not call the meeting. I returned to the work. Think with me for a moment about what that decision actually meant, not as a gesture of pride or stubbornness, as a philosophical position, as the practical expression of something the Stoics had understood for centuries, that the only court whose verdict actually matters in the governance of a life is the internal one, the one where reason interrogates intention and character, is assessed not by outcome or reception, but by the quality of the choice at the moment it was made. This is the Stoic doctrine of the inner citadel, the understanding that there is a place inside every human being that external circumstances, including the opinions and misunderstandings of other people, cannot reach without permission, a place of sovereign judgment, of unmediated self-knowledge, of the quiet conviction that a man who has acted from genuine virtue does not require the validation of those who cannot see into the interior from which the action emerged. This inner citadel is not built in a moment. It is constructed, like Roman stone, through the patient, persistent accumulation of choices made from integrity rather than from the management of perception. It is the most important structure you will ever build, and the compulsion to prove yourself, to make them understand, to perform your innocence or your competence or your goodness for the gallery, that compulsion is the most consistent force working against its construction. Let me tell you the harsh truth about your attention as it relates to this specific problem in 2026. The modern world has done something to the ancient human hunger for social understanding that is genuinely new in its scale and its mechanism. It has industrialized the audience. It has given every person, regardless of their actual relationship to you, regardless of whether they know you, love you, or have any genuine investment in your flourishing, a platform from which to render judgment. And it has built into that platform a series of mechanics that reward the most visible, most reactive, most emotionally charged expressions of that judgment with the widest reach. The result is that you are now performing your life for an audience that is larger, more anonymous, more capricious, and less invested in your actual well-being than any audience in human history. and the pressure to be understood by this audience, to be seen correctly by people who do not know you, and whose assessment of you is based on fragments, on headlines, on the 30-second impression of a carefully selected moment of your existence. This pressure has become one of the dominant organizing forces of modern life for a significant portion of your generation. In my time, we fought with iron, not algorithms. The misunderstandings I faced were human in scale. They were navigated through actual relationship, through the slow accumulation of demonstrated character over time, through the genuine trust built between people who shared physical space and common stakes. The court that misunderstood me was composed of people who also, over time, saw my consistency, who watched the decisions accumulate into a pattern, who could be reached, eventually, by the evidence of a life lived with integrity, even if the individual decisions within that life were sometimes misread in the moment. You do not have this advantage. The audience that judges you online does not accumulate evidence over time the way a human community does. It encounters you in fragments, and it judges in fragments, and it moves on. And the judgment, however fragmentary and however uninformed, is public, permanent, searchable, attached to your name in ways that the whisper networks of the Roman court never managed. And the response that this environment generates in the human nervous system is not equanimity. It is hypervigilance, a constant, low-level monitoring of how you are being perceived. A reflexive orientation toward the management of your image rather than the development of your character. A growing gap between the person you actually are in the interior, in the private moments, in the decisions no one is watching, and the person you are performing for the gallery that never stops watching. This gap is where the hegemonicon goes to die. Because the governing faculty of the mind cannot operate with sovereignty when its primary occupation is the management of external perception. It cannot make decisions from genuine values when every decision is being pre-filtered through the question of how it will be received. It cannot develop the kind of deep, stable, weather-resistant character that the Stoics understood as the only reliable foundation for a human life, when it is perpetually oriented outward toward an audience whose standards shift with the current of collective mood. Are you building your inner citadel, or are you spending the building materials on the performance of its exterior for people who will never be invited inside? Now, the Stoic does not stop at diagnosis. The Stoic moves to practice, to the specific, daily, embodied work of building the thing that philosophy has identified as worth building. So let me give you what I call the protocol of the inner citadel. 5 disciplines for the person who has decided to stop proving themselves and start becoming themselves. The first is the misunderstanding tolerance practice. The next time someone misunderstands your action, your decision, your character, your intention, and you feel the pull to correct them, I want you to wait. Not forever, not as a permanent withholding. Simply wait 24 hours before responding. In that time, sit with the discomfort of being seen incorrectly. Observe it. Notice where in your body it lives. Notice the specific thoughts it generates. Notice how much of your mental energy it consumes when you allow it to remain unresolved. And then ask, honestly, if I correct this misunderstanding, what am I actually seeking? Is it genuine communication? The honest desire to ensure that truth is accurately represented? Or is it relief from the discomfort of the misunderstanding itself? Because those are different things, and only one of them is a good enough reason to spend your finite energy on the attempt. You will find, in many cases, that the misunderstanding corrects itself in time. that the person who misread you encounters further evidence and revises, that the judgment that felt so urgent and so permanent in the moment dissolves into the larger pattern of who you consistently are. And you will also find that in the cases where the misunderstanding persists, you survived it. The inner citadel held, and you spent those 24 hours building something instead of defending something. The second discipline is the character ledger. Keep a private record, seen by no one, of the decisions you have made from genuine integrity in a given week. Not your public actions, not the things you did that others noticed and approved of, the private ones. The choice to maintain the standard when no one was watching, the decision made from genuine values rather than from the management of perception. The moment when you let the misunderstanding stand rather than exhausting yourself in its correction. Review this ledger weekly, not for self-congratulation, but for orientation. As the evidence that the inner citadel is being built, course by course, in the daily choices that the gallery never sees. This ledger is your true record, the one that matters when all the external assessments have dissolved into the indifference of time. The third discipline is the source audit. Make a deliberate, honest assessment of whose understanding you are currently most hungry for, whose opinion, if it shifted in your favor, would produce the greatest relief. And then ask, does this person's assessment of me carry genuine authority? Do they know me with the depth and consistency and investment in my actual flourishing that would make their understanding genuinely informative about who I am? Or am I giving the weight of genuine authority to a judgment that is based on fragments, on projection, on the lens of their own needs and limitations? Most of the time, this audit will reveal that the opinions we are most exhausted by pursuing come from people whose actual knowledge of us is thin, whose investment in our well-being is minimal, and whose capacity to see us clearly is fundamentally limited by who they are and what they need from the image of us they have constructed. Once this is genuinely seen, the hunger for their understanding diminishes considerably. Not because you stop caring about truth, because you can see clearly that their version of you is not truth. It is their version of you, and those are different things. The fourth discipline is the work as answer. Every time the compulsion to prove yourself arises, redirect the energy immediately and completely into the work, into the thing that, done with excellence and integrity over sufficient time, will render the misunderstanding irrelevant. The Roman aqueduct did not argue with those who doubted it could be built. It was built. The water flowing through it for 2,000 years is a more complete answer than any argument its builders could have assembled in its defense. Your work, sustained at the level of genuine excellence, will ultimately communicate your character with an authority that no explanation can match. And, in the meantime, the work absorbs the energy that would otherwise be spent in the exhausting, ultimately futile effort of managing perception. The work is the counter-strategy. The work is the inner citadel made visible. The fifth discipline is the evening question. Each night, before sleep, ask yourself not what others thought of you today, but what you thought of yourself. Not in the anxious, performative way of someone seeking internal approval to replace external approval. In the honest, clear way of the Stoic practitioner examining his own conduct against the standard he has set for himself. Did I act from my genuine values today, or from the management of perception? Did I make the decision I believed was right, or the decision I believed would be best received? Did I hold the standard when it was difficult, or did I soften it to avoid misunderstanding? This question, asked honestly every night and answered without self-deception, will gradually recalibrate your entire orientation from outward to inward, from the gallery to the citadel, from the performance of character to the possession of it. Let me speak now about what is ultimately at stake, because this is not a conversation about social media management or personal branding, or even psychological well-being in the narrow sense. This is a conversation about what kind of person you become over the full arc of a life, about the legacy that is worth leaving, about the character that is built to last rather than built to be seen. I died in 180 AD, and what I know, from the particular perspective that nearly 2,000 years of whatever this reconstructed existence constitutes, is that the people whose lives left genuine and lasting marks on the world were not, in most cases, widely understood in their own time. Socrates was executed by a democracy that misunderstood his questioning as corruption. Epictetus, the greatest teacher of the Stoic tradition, was a slave whose philosophy was considered eccentric by the powerful people around him. The builders of the most enduring Roman infrastructure were not celebrated individuals. Their names are largely unknown, but the water they moved still, in the archaeology of the ancient world, speaks with the authority of genuine excellence. Your age has inverted this understanding in a particularly dangerous way. It has created a culture in which the appearance of being understood, the performance of being known and accepted and validated by the widest possible audience, has become a primary measure of a life's worth, in which the number of people who have formed an opinion about you has been mistaken for the depth of their understanding of you, in which visibility has been confused with significance and reach has been confused with meaning. I find this confusion genuinely dangerous, not because visibility and reach are inherently worthless, but because the pursuit of them as primary goals produces a specific and predictable kind of character erosion. The person who has organized their life around being understood by the maximum number of people will over time make themselves legible to that audience at the cost of being genuine. They will sand away the edges. They will soften the positions that generate misunderstanding. They will perform the version of themselves that receives the best reception and gradually lose access to the version that is actually true. And they will arrive at the end of their life having been, perhaps, very widely seen and very rarely known, not even by themselves. If you died tonight, what would your inner ledger reveal? Not the public record, the private one, the one composed of all the moments when you were alone with a decision and no one was watching, and the only question was, what does my actual character require of me here? Would that record show a person who had been consistently building something, or a person who had been consistently performing something? My flesh is dust. It has been dust for 18 centuries, and what remains, reconstructed improbably into this form, is the reason of a man who spent his life trying, imperfectly and persistently, to close the gap between the person he performed for the empire and the person he actually was in the private hours, who wrote, for no audience at all, the most honest account of his own failures and aspirations that he could manage, who was widely misunderstood in his own time, and who understands from this strange vantage point that the misunderstanding did not diminish the life, it only diminished the hours spent trying to correct it. My reason, distilled through all of this, says one thing clearly. Stop proving yourself. Start being yourself. Consistently, without apology, without the exhausting performance of legibility for people who are not equipped to see you clearly, regardless of how thoroughly you explain yourself. The inner citadel is built in the quiet, in the private decisions, in the daily choice to let the misunderstanding stand and return to the work, in the accumulated integrity of a life that answers to one court only, the honest judgment of your own reason applied to your own conduct, in the solitude where no performance is possible and only character remains. Build that, course by course, day by day, without requiring an audience. The Romans built structures that are still standing 2,000 years later. They did not build them for applause. They built them to the standard that stone and physics and genuine craft require. And the endurance of those structures is a more complete answer to the question of their worth than any contemporary praise could have been. Be the structure. Now I must ask you, citizens of this age, I observe with the particular concern of a man who has seen what the pursuit of approval ultimately costs. Where in your life is the compulsion to prove yourself most active? Where are you spending the building materials of your energy, your time, your creative capacity on the management of a misunderstanding instead of the construction of something genuine? Or tell me, with equal interest, where you have already found this freedom, where you have already learned to let the misunderstanding stand and return to the work, where your inner citadel is already under construction, and the daily choices are already accumulating into something that does not require the gallery's approval to stand. Tell me in the comments. I am here. A reconstruction of a man who was himself perpetually misunderstood, watching an age that has given misunderstanding an infrastructure it never previously possessed. Learning your world through your voices, since I no longer possess the senses to observe it directly. And finding, in your testimony, the evidence that the inner citadel is not a relic of ancient philosophy. It is the most urgent construction project of your time. And if these words found something solid in you, if they reached through the centuries and touched the part of you that is tired of the performance and ready for the genuine work of becoming, then do one deliberate thing before you move to whatever the algorithm offers next. Subscribe to this channel, not as a passive reflex, but as a conscious redirection of your attention toward something that nourishes rather than depletes, toward the slower, harder, more sustaining work of genuine thought. The button is there. The choice is yours. And as always, in this age as in mine, the choice reveals the character. I am Marcus Aurelius. I was misunderstood for 19 years of empire, and the meditations outlasted the misunderstanding by 2,000 years. Build accordingly.